Welcome. My name is Mark Csikszentmihalyi, and I'm co-director, along with Jonathan Sheehan of the Department of History of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. I want to take a couple minutes to introduce the lecture series in the center before making way for Janaki Bakle of the History Department, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's lecture is made possible by the Endowed Fund for the Study of Religious Tolerance. This fund enables the university to promote and disseminate research on the dimensions of religious tolerance and the sources of religious intolerance. It's a key part of the public program of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, which attempts to incubate a distinctively Berkeley approach to the interdisciplinary study of religion in the world. Our next event is on February 17th, and there's information and a sign-up for our mailing list available as you come in the room. I'll now let Janaki Bakle now introduce Niall Green, tonight's speaker.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce all of you to Professor Niall Green. Niall Green took his PhD from SOAS in 2002, and in the last 11 years since then, he has been extraordinarily busy. He's professor of history at UCLA and the author of 4 monographs with 4 more in the wings, among them the intriguingly titled Mr. Darcy's Persians, what 5 Muslim students learned in Jane Austen's London, and the Muslim Discovery of the World, Islamic Travels in a Global Arena. He has also edited 5 collections and written 66 articles. All of which leads me to ask a central question. Professor Green, do you sleep ever? Or eat?
Always till 9 if I can.
But clearly he doesn't sleep. And what keeps him awake are blessed men, as he calls them, Sufi sheikhs and peers. But more importantly, the world they inhabit, the rulers they influence, the people they bless, the mortar of the shrines in which their bodies are eventually interred, and the memories they invoke when some become saints. In the ongoing Durkheimian transformative world of rituals involving weddings, death anniversaries, birth anniversaries, processions, laments. All of this should signal to you that Niall Green does not work within the orthodoxy of scholarship on Sufis and Sufism. His blessed men are not transcendental mystic figures who float above the messy material world. Indeed, what he shows us is that they were, and Niall forgive the popular reference, that they were living in a material world, and they were material men. Now, for the field of Indian history and religious studies more generally, this is no small contribution. Sufis and Sufism is generally written about as popular and transcendent devotionalism, rendered analogous to the Hindu world of bhakti in historical scholarship, dovetailing neatly alongside it in the chronological period from the 12th to the 18th centuries. To such an understanding, Niall Green's first book, Indian Sufism Since the 17th Century, offers a sharp rebuke and was described by Francis Robinson as an unusually accomplished first book. In it, Green focused on the historical trajectories of 3 Sufi traditions of Aurangabad over 300 years, from the 17th century through to 1948. He tracks as well the rewriting of Indian Sufi history in the late 19th and early 20th century against the backdrop described for us by Shumat Sarkar as the period of reform and revival. And his argument is that the mounting pressure of an exclusionary nationalism hemmed the subcontinent's Sufi history into the boundaries of national India, cutting off, thereby, Sufi Islam's always global interconnectedness. And he has been persistent in unraveling that stitching to show us that if there is one thing Sufi Islam transcends, it is national boundaries and borders, but not the real world. Professor Green's other works include Islam in the Army in Colonial India, about which I do not have time to say very much, but more recently, Bombay Islam, the religious economy of the West Indian Ocean, which received the Albert Hourani Award for Outstanding Publishing in Middle East Studies and the A.K. Kumaraswamy Award in Asian Studies. Now, for anyone who has been in Bombay, whether in Bhindi Bazaar or Muhammad Ali Road or in Mahim, at the Dargah of, say, Baba Mahima, when the yearly Urs, the celebration, takes place, Bombay Islam documents the familiar, but with a striking difference. His argument on Bombay Islam is a provocative one, likely to generate a good bit of debate. Here's what he says. In the 20th century, an array of Muslim communities, Khojas, Memons, Bohras, Aga Khani Ismailis, Neo-Ismailis, rewrote and popularized their version of Islam against the backdrop of the free market enterprise that was colonial Bombay. This rewriting, for him, was customary Islam, as modern as its quote-unquote reformed counterpart, with the shrines now recategorized by him as firms and his blessed men as entrepreneurs, competing for their particular interpretations of Islam in the marketplace using the tools and language of a capitalist proselytizing mission introduced to them by 19th century Christian missionaries. In Bombay Islam, as in his other works, some strains remain consistent. Green's deliberate privileging of what one might call Middle Eastern texts over Indian ones, in order to break, as he will put it, the stranglehold of Indian nationalism and the study of Indian Islam. A focus on the materiality of Islam and the insistence that certainly in South Asia, there is no one Islam but many, and they are all global in their interconnectedness. Bombay Islam reminds us of Eng Seng Ho's work on Java and Yemen, as do the essays in his most recent work, Making Space, Sufis and Settlers in Early Modern India, which takes one central question as its theme. How does an itinerant community that takes its sense of identity from itinerancy, from being on the move, establish a sense of place in space? If Sufis were blessed men on the move, saints, by contrast, are, in Green's words, products of commemoration. All blessed men do not become saints, but those that do enable, through architecture, literary production, and ritual recognition, the posthumous connecting of the lives of their followers, Hindu and Muslim alike, into a community of believers, and allow for the repeated commemoration to sustain a sense of community that is much more than merely national. Niall Green's work is important for this centre and for this lecture for many reasons, not least because of its insistence on a non-national or post-national understanding of regional Islam. His work has had a direct impact on that scholarship, to be sure, but also on the contemporary conversation on secularism and tolerance in South Asia. On this subject, the debate is intense. Romila Thapar, now Rajiv Bhargav, and Rajiv Kindra, on the one hand, have made the case for a long-standing epistemological foundation for tolerance across the Hindu-Muslim millennia, from Pali to Persian. On the other hand, we have the formidable work of Ashish Nandiopartha Chatterjee, who have argued, different from each other, that secularism as a concept is foreign to the South Asian subcontinent, and its inadequacy as category or policy is manifest in the recent religious violence against Muslims. Feminists in India and Pakistan have weighed in on the same subject, self-included, to challenge the dismissal of the secular as possible only when women's bodies and women's writings are absented from the dialogue, at the same time that our colleague Sabah Mahmood has argued for an understanding of Muslim women's subjectivity that is not predicated on the unitary self assumed by Enlightenment diktat. Niall Green's work on the lived reality of tolerance in Bombay Islam promises to take the debate on secularism and tolerance in new directions. Please join me in welcoming him. He will speak to us now of Muslim travels and the making of tolerance. Niall Green.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure as well as an honor to be here this evening to speak to this endowed lecture on such an important and worthy subject. I'd like to thank the people who invited me, Mark Csikszentmihalyi and Jonathan Sheehan from the Center for the Study of Religion, and particularly to Janaki Berkeley, who I can't see now the lights from my eyes. I see you there. Thank you really for that really very flattering introduction. And thanks also for Carrie, who's also out there somewhere, for setting up everything so perfectly. Well, today I want to move away from some of those earlier things I've written about over the years, those Sufis, those blessed men, and to talk more about Muslims as travellers, and Muslims really on a global stage rather than an Indian or Middle Eastern stage. I want to make the case that tolerance has a history, and that history is to be found in places where we might least expect it. And if tolerance has a history, then that in turn implies that it's not innate, it's not inherently present in one culture or one religion any more than in another. And that premise in turn implies that tolerance is circumstantial, it's developmental, it sometimes progresses and sometimes regresses. It emerges from particular circumstances, especially circumstances, I'll argue today, of contact and exchange. Tolerance is one, and not the only one, outcome of such interactions and contacts. And since the field of global history studies those kinds of circumstances of interaction, exchange, that's the approach I'll be taking today by doing what I kind of see myself as doing in much of my work, really, of trying to position Islamic history into world or global history. Well, I think it'd be useful at this point then to define the object of study, define tolerance, at least how I'm going to try to work with it today in this kind of historicising mode. I'm happy to follow the Oxford Dictionary in saying that in defining tolerance, or the verb to tolerate, in allowing without interference the existence, the occurrence or practice of something that one doesn't necessarily agree with. But of course tolerate with its etymology, and of course with the medieval Latin verb to carry or to bear something, much like in fact in Arabic and Persian word tahammul, the sense of bearing and carrying something, I think is a pretty minimal definition. And what I'd like to add on today is really in some ways to go beyond tolerance, to move towards even affection as well as understanding of the other. Well, if that's a definition of tolerance, I'd like to work more in terms of defining tolerance as a historian. And I think tolerance has four aspects or dimensions, four constituent parts, which I think historians can grapple with and social scientists can grapple with and actually do some analytical work with. The first of those constituent parts is social. As I've already mentioned, I think that tolerance emerges from interaction and from contact. And from more than that, I think it requires more than merely two peoples or two religions or civilizations contacting and interacting. I think it requires communication as well, which is often, as we'll see, a linguistic phenomenon apart from anything else. Communication in turn then generates understanding and possibly at times, as I've already mentioned, sympathy, such that I think tolerance has intellectual as well as emotional dimensions. These then are the social aspects of tolerance as I see it. But as a historian, I also think that tolerance has a geographical, a spatial dimension. And of course, since history is the study of context, the study of places and locations, and now how they interact with and shape the outcomes, the cultural or social products of those places, this is helpful, I think, for the kind of analysis I want to give by focusing on points of contact, of what in the language of global history then we might think of as nodes of communication, places like Bombay, which will be one of these port cities, the particular places, spaces of contact that I'll be talking about today. So these sites of global exchange then I think can also be seen as kind of geographies of tolerance. Port cities on the one hand, but also appropriately that we're standing in a campus today, spaces of education and educational interaction as well. So we have social and geographical dimensions. There are also cultural dimensions. I think it's important to recognize, particularly when we're looking at, let's say, kind of a world or comparative context, that tolerance is our word. It's a word that has its own genealogy, its own history within the English language, of course, most particularly going back to that key point of John Locke's 1689 letter concerning toleration. So I think it's important to recognize that not all tolerances, not all forms of toleration are going to be alike, and certainly not all discourses and languages and terms of toleration are going to be alike. So what I'm not going to do today is offer, as it were, a Begriffsgeschichte, a kind of a conceptual history of the word toleration in various Islamic languages. I think that would be philologically boring and you'd leave before your time. So I'm not going to do that today. But what I'm going to do is focus more on the kind of recognizing the plurality, the cultural dimensions of tolerance, and to focus more on tolerance as a form of practice. And I think within the frame of global history then, I think global history really requires an eye for variety as well as comparison. I think we'll see then these various forms, if you like, a different culture, maybe even a globalizing Islamic culture of tolerance as practice in the case studies I'll turn to. So we have some social, geographical, some cultural constituent parts of toleration, and there are also, of course, psychological parts of toleration as well. Of course, we all know through the everyday empiricism of casual observation, that some people are more tolerant than others. Some personalities are more tolerant than others, perhaps more compassionate, open-minded, we might say. And vice versa as well. Some personalities, some psychologists are less tolerant. But what do we do with that? Of course, for historians and for social scientists more generally, psychology, personality, the human factor, of course, is the toughest variable of all. It's the toughest thing to measure. The very humanness of humanity is the most tricky variable of all. But I don't want to override what I think is really that psychological dimension of tolerance, what I think is really kind of a crucial part of tolerance as a human experience and a form of human engagement. I'm going to try to touch on that psychological dimension of tolerance then in places by looking at some of the emotional sides of what I'll be talking about, of these different forms of the practice of tolerance. Well, so much for defining tolerance then as social, geographical, cultural, even psychological. But what of the topic then of Islam and tolerance? Well, it's a big subject, needless to say. Many approaches to the topic of Islam and tolerance, particularly in the last 12 years, let's say, have really taken what I would think of as a theological approach. True Islam is tolerance, etc., etc. I think these are very valid and worthwhile social and kind of interfaith and intercommunal forms of discourse and speech, and I think they're all for the good. But as a historian who thinks of himself as a social scientist, I find them really kind of analytically unconvincing. Of course, one can make a case that Islam, the very word salam, denotes peace. But one can also make, of course, a strong case, as various Muslims in the world do today, that true Islam is based around jihad and not peace. So I think these theological approaches then are really analytically useless, because for the social scientist, doctrines, terms, discourses, theological terms, scriptures, these are symbolic resources that different social actors can use to achieve different ends. Theology can be used to justify violence or peace, tolerance or intolerance. That's one of the reasons that I'm not, I'm moving away from a theological approach today and really want to make the point very clearly that I'm working through this historicizing approach to think through practices of tolerance. Clearly, there have been many different historical periods of Muslim tolerance, many different modes of tolerance, one might say, through the ages. In the 7th and 8th century, the early decades of Islamic history, there was the notion forged, which of course survives through to this day, of Jews and Christians as being the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, a phrase of the recognition of, as it were, valid religions that followers went astray from core valid messages, a term of the people of the book that was later given to Zoroastrians as well as Hindus in India. So there was this very early different mode of toleration, and in particular, if you like, a kind of an Islamic imperial mode in the early Islamic centuries. There were other modes as well, from whether in 9th century Baghdad or 17th century Mughal Delhi, of forms of tolerance through the study and translation of non-Muslim religious writings, from Sanskrit into Arabic under the Abbasids of Baghdad, or from Sanskrit into Persian under the Mughals of India. Much later, in the 19th and early 20th century, there were many legal reforms in different Muslim states, the Ottoman Empire, and subsequently in the secular post-colonial states of the Middle East, that gave equal citizenship to people, citizens of all different religions, a form of a legal mode of tolerance, as it were. So there are certainly these different modes, these different historical periods of Muslim tolerance. But what I want to focus on today is a more recent, if not quite so recent period, what we might think of as the first age of globalization. The period then when, through the technologies of steam travel in particular, Muslims as well as many other Asian peoples and peoples of the Americas and Europe as well, were able to travel around the world and have much more increased interactions and contacts and exchanges in the kinds of geographies and sites of contact that I want to talk about today. I want to use then Muslim travel writings, mostly in Persian and Urdu, from the early 19th century through till the mid-20th century then, to create a series of case studies that will help us to trace these constituent parts of tolerance that I've talked about, geographical, cultural, and so on. I want to use this historicist approach as well to show that these contacts and contexts generate as one outcome tolerance, but also at times intolerance as well. So we have these variable outcomes then of the interactions that we often call, in a word, of globalization. And what I want to focus on in particular is tolerance as a historical process, and that's why today I've called this talk The Making of Tolerance. Well, for historians, and this is useful because these kind of works, whether archivally or printed documents that I've been working on for a few years now, largely travelogues and the literatures and records around them, of course serve as paper trails to tolerance that help us track then these particular locations, these particular practices of tolerance. Since we're here at a university at Berkeley, I wanted to start today with the theme of education and with the theme of students, student movements and student exchanges. With this first group of Muslim Middle Eastern students who ever came to study in Western Europe, a group of 6 Persians, 6 Iranians who came to study in Britain in the year 1811. After this gentleman on the left, the arresting figure of Mirza Abul Hassan Khan, the ambassador of the court of Persia to London, arrived in 1810. This was then, as I say, the beginning of in many ways, of Middle Eastern, or particularly Iranian and Persian, intellectual, as well as we'll see, more broadly cultural and even emotional exchange with Britain. One of the students, Mirza Saleh, his name is up there on the right, left a 400- or 500-page Persian diary of his 5 years in London, and it's that I'm using to reconstruct what follows now. And it really is a diary that really shows us that there really were these Persians very much at the heart of Jane Austen's world, not least that they took the waters in Bath, just like Emma, and really interacted with that gay world. Quite happily, as it's already been mentioned in the title of the book I've been writing about these figures, the person who was their chaperone around Britain for their 4 years was called Mr. Darcy. So that really works rather nicely for me. Well, I talked about contact and exchange as really not being enough to generate tolerance, that we also, I think, require communication, a deeper level of exchange, and perhaps ultimately a form of exchange that generates affection as well. And the first thing that the students did, I mean, this is a period in 1811 when they first turned up. This is a period when there is no dictionary, Persian to English dictionary. There is no way to learn English at this point that, in what we would now think of as the linguistic apparatus, perhaps, of globalization or global exchange. The first thing they had to do then was to learn English, and it wasn't altogether very clear how a group of young men from Persia would do that. What they decided to do, rather cleverly, was wander out of London down to the town of Croydon. Aptly enough, Croydon now is the centre for the UK immigration services, but they were there before this was the case, and when it was one of the sites of the two East India Company academies, the East India Company's military academy at Addiscombe, which is now in Croydon. They went down there partly because they'd run out of money, and they realised there were many young Englishmen who were keen to further their careers by passing their Persian exams there, the East India Company's exams. And they could make some money by teaching Persian and in exchange learning not only English but also French and Latin as well. So communication then was one of the key ways in which what was seen as generating a form of tolerance among these first Middle Eastern students in the West. But a point that I also want to stress here was that this was in a sense a kind of a two-way exchange, and not, as it were, a one-sided generation of tolerance. It was two-way. When they first arrived in London, before they could learn English, they were able to speak Persian. The people that crop up, 2 men in particular, crop up in Mirza Saleh's diaries, his firmest, fastest and oldest friends in Britain. Some of the South Asians here might recognize the names. One, John Malcolm, the other, Gaur Uzli, who both spent time in India, in Lucknow, and later in Bombay in one case, and also one of them served as ambassador to Persia. The other one served as the ambassador secretary to Persia. So there was this, in a sense, kind of a two-way exchange of languages as well as affection that came later. And this two-way generation of tolerance wasn't linked uniquely to Persian speakers in Britain. By the time Mirza Saleh, we see him there on the right, he was, interesting enough, the almost Iran's Gutenberg. He took back from London what turned out to be the second printing press ever to print in Iran. And that's one of the engravings that came out of the printing process he took to Iran. Mirza Saleh also is significant, less known for this, but certainly very important for being perhaps the first Muslim to write a description of the dissenting religions of Europe, the dissenting Christianities, the Baptists, the Unitarians, the Methodists, really moving away in his own right from, if you like, a theological discourse of normative Christians in a way that they've been perceived for centuries, to more human, more textured, more ethnographic appreciation of the varieties of being Christian, not least through the Unitarians. He spent, it seems only from his diary, just over a week, maybe 10 days, in the city of Bristol. And while he was in Bristol, he met this gentleman on the left, Reverend Land Carpenter. Reverend Land Carpenter was a very influential and was to become a very influential Unitarian Christian, not least through his development of widening the scope of Unitarian theology to become the kind of Unitarianism we often think of as perhaps the most tolerant of all Christianities, of taking great interest and in many ways acceptance in some Unitarian theologies of non-Christian religions. Land Carpenter spent some time with Mirza Saleh. Mirza Saleh describes him in his diary. Later, Land Carpenter also became important for hosting Raj Mohan Roy, the first of the Indian Hindu reformists who is in fact buried in Bristol. But what I think is interesting, this kind of two-way generation of tolerance between these two figures, is it was only just a couple of years before Mirza Saleh turned up in Britain and turned up in Bristol that the Unitarians themselves were tolerated in England. The 1689 Act of Toleration had only tolerated Trinitarian Christians, Christians who believed in and declared their belief in the Trinity. It was only with the Doctrine of the Trinity Act of 1813 that the Unitarians who denied the truth of the Trinity were themselves tolerated. And that's an interesting point, and it's an interesting conjunction, because it's also been argued, not least by Timothy Winter, the British Muslim Cambridge-based scholar, that the Trinity Act, the Doctrine of the Trinity Act of 1813, also for the first time made it legal to be a Muslim in Britain. So one can see in some ways perhaps a sense of elective affinities between Mirza Saleh and Land Carpenter. And not least because Mirza Saleh in his diary describes Land Carpenter and those Unitarians as being muwahidun, Unitarians, quite simply as a translation, but also a term that can be equated with Muslims as well. It was also a word used a few centuries, well, by this point 2 centuries earlier, in India by the Indian Mughal prince Dara Shikoh to refer to the true believers among both the Hindus and the Muslims. So there's this, as it were, this discourse then of tolerance, of being Unitarians, that is a history then that connects the Unitarian Christians of Bristol, Mirza Saleh from Persia, and also the Muslims and Hindus of India. But it wasn't only with religious dissenters, Christian dissenters, that the Persian students met while they were in England. They also spent a good time learning the new sciences, the so-called ulum-i-jadid, the new sciences that they're in fact sent to Britain to master. One of the figures they studied with, who cropped up a great deal in the diary of Mirza Saleh, is this figure, Dr. Gregory, Dr. Alinthus Gregory. He published here in the year that they arrived in London, 1815, his treatise on mechanics. And it was through him that the students learned a great deal of the modern sciences, the new scientific disciplines, the breakthroughs, the beginnings of chemistry, new forms of medicine, as well as printing and other sciences that were spreading in London at the centre of the Industrial Revolution. I think this captures a very important theme throughout the later 19th century that I think in many ways continues to this day. A respect among Muslims for Western learning, because this ulum-i-jadid, this new learning as it was called, was also known as the ulum-i-farangi, the learning of the Europeans, the learning of the Franks. So science and the quest for science, I think, and the discovery, I think, in some ways of a universal language of science was also, I think, one of these intellectual factors that I've talked about in the generation of tolerance. But matters weren't only scientific, there were also these cultural dimensions too. This was a period when the students were in London from 1811 through to 1819. In the midst of that, the most famous or the most important of the early Orientalist works of English literature were published. Thomas More's Lara Rukh, the long prose poem about a Persian princess that opens up with a very positive evocation of Persia and its grandeur. Interesting enough, an example of what I've called pre-post-colonial taste, because I don't think Professor Saeed would have agreed with this very much, but the fact of the matter is that the Persian students, when they were asked and interviewed about what were their favourite things they'd learned and read in Britain, they cited Sir Thomas More's La Ruch. So there really was this sort of sense, again, of kind of cultural affinity and even affection between the two. In the terminology of the other travelogue to emerge from those meetings in this period of the ambassador himself, Mirza Abul Hassan, who brought the students to London and took them back on his second journey in 1819, London was a place of hayrat, a place of wonder. And indeed, he termed his travelogue to London the Hayrat-Nameh, the Book of Wonder. So one of the discourses, and I think of interest, of positive affection and attitude towards the other then emerged in this period, a language of wonder, a language of hayrat. So if we've seen something of perhaps the cultural, the intellectual, the social dimensions of the generation of tolerance here, we also need, I think, to look at geography, which I've invoked. And it's interesting that the very place, the very geography within which the Persian students moved, in which they situated themselves, was at the heart of émigré London. Where they lived was, in fact, in this building here, happily next to a French brasserie, now the Africa Centre, somewhere I used to hang out as an undergraduate. So I was very happy when I found out that that's where they were living. But this was an important place to be in this period. In a few decades earlier, this is the site of London, the district of London, Soho, that had housed various émigrés from Central Europe, Mozart, Handel, Voltaire. Just in the previous 20 years, vast numbers of French Huguenots and Catholics had fled the terror of the Revolution, such that by 1810, there were no fewer than 9,600 Catholics alone living in Soho. And in subsequent decades, Marx and Mazzini would also live in the district of Soho. So there really was, I think, a kind of a geographical sense to their toleration too. And from geographies, of course, geographies are spaces of contact, spaces of interaction. And what more interaction than love and marriage? Because one of the students, Muhammad Ali, ended up marrying the daughter of his landlord there, just off Covent Garden in the heart of Soho, Miss Mary Dudley. It's a peculiar document. When I came across this in the National Archives of London, I must say I was really quite shocked, because it's a rather odd thing when one reads a marriage certificate issued in a church of the Church of England, the Anglican Established Church of England, that there's someone there titled Ustad Muhammad Ali, a bachelor. And I did wonder at the time, did no one say, are you a Christian, sir? But nonetheless, there seems to have been some peculiar unstated act of tolerance or turning a blind eye or what, I don't know, going on there in the face of this love affair. But certainly Muhammad Ali and Miss Mary Dudley did marry, and Mary Dudley in turn went back to Iran and became, I think, the first, we know of in modern times, the first British woman to settle and spend the rest of her life in Persia. But I think we can glimpse there too the psychological, the affective dimensions of tolerance, but also, I think, a sense of a kind of the two-way generation of tolerance as well, in that kind of human, psychological, emotional aspect. Let's stay on the theme then of amorous encounters for a moment then with another ambassador. We're moving from Persia now to India and to the amorous ambassador, Muhammad Ismail Khan. I bought this small token, this small ephemera of exchange from a historical autograph dealer in London some years ago, and it wasn't really clear what it was. It was being sold on the basis that the autograph at the bottom was a historical autograph of Mirza Muhammad Hassan Khan Bahadur, the ruler of the Indian kingdom and subsequently princely state, and subsequently part of the British India somewhat later, of Awadh in North India. But what interested me was this other bit of prose and poetry at the top. بِپاس خاطر کار العین فوق از مرحوم میشود در فالمته, and then a date, 1836. I was unclear what partly this meant, this peculiar thing, kar al-ain fawq as. Those of you who are more quick-witted than me will realize far quicker than I did that this is in fact a name, and an English name, Caroline Fox. What we have beneath that, and what it turns out this document is actually from the autograph book of Caroline Fox, and scribbled in there by the amorous ambassador Muhammad Ismail Khan as he passed through the port of Falmata, which is to say Falmouth in southwestern England. He scrawled this bit of kind of doggerel verse in a way, but it kind of has its charms, I think. صد هزاران صورتند قالب حسن و جمال ریختند اما چون تو مطبوع کمتر ریختند. 100,000 faces, beautiful and gorgeous, were flung from the matrix, but like you, they printed few. So it's a kind of charming bit of flirtation. For me, it's also kind of striking that it actually mentions the language, the qalib, the matrix, matbu'ah, printing, just 18 years after printing had turned up in that very city of Agad. So it's a kind of strange mixture of the scientific and the emotional dimensions of exchange that I was talking about a moment ago. Who was the person in question? This was the young Miss Caroline Fox, only 17 years old at the time, but it's probably fair enough that she couldn't read what was written anyway. In fact, in her own diary, she says that he wrote something quite different. He wrote something, I think, altogether more respectable, but now we know, 200 years later. Anyway, but there she was. But it's kind of striking as well that even in this very small provincial town, Falmouth, this too was another space of interaction, a place of tolerance and understanding and at least affection. That very autograph book from which that bit of doggerel verse was torn, once back in the day had the autographs of Coleridge and Wordsworth, which explains why it was broken up and those autographs dispersed and one of them ended up with me. So we have a move then, I think, from diplomacy to literature perhaps, to flirtation, and I would also suggest to a kind of tolerance that comes with that. In the description, at least in Caroline Fox's own diaries, there's a very positive description, not only of the ambassador, Mohammed Hassan Khan, but also of the entire Indian entourage that came with him then. So tolerance then is situational and affective. Let's move back towards the steadier ground of science and education. An Indian educationist abroad then. So we're moving forward in time from the 1830s now to moving to 1869 when Sayyid Ahmad Khan makes his journey to London, recounted in his travelogue there, the title page of the printed version on the right, or the contents page on the right. Sayyid Ahmad Khan was perhaps the most important Indian reformist, perhaps the most important Indian intellectual of Muslim intellectual of the 19th century, certainly one of the most important Muslim thinkers of the 19th century and of the modern age in general. And in many ways that grandeur, that intellectual grandeur, that stature he developed, I think really came from his bravery, his intellectual generosity, and really thinking through what it meant when two cultures, two civilizations, two religions come together, even in the harshest of colonial circumstances. In 1869, then, he made the trip to London that is described in his travelogue. He was bringing with him his son. It was a kind of educational trip. He was escorting his son to drop him off at campus, as it were. And this today, even in London, that space of exchange is still recorded today on 21 Mecklenburgh Square near Gray's Inn, the Inns of Court in London, where his son went to study law. But what came out of that was not only some legal qualifications for Ahmad Khan Jr., but more importantly, the reproduction of places of education and places, I would argue very much in the Indian context here, a space of tolerance. The foundation, a few years after Sir Syed, as he became Syed Ahmad Khan, returned to India, he founded, as it was known then, the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, what he very much wanted to be, a Muslim Oxford. And the idea that in that name, that strange hybrid name, Anglo-Oriental, was that this was a place where both English and Islamic topics could be studied, and particularly, as it turned out, through the English language. Aligarh Muslim University, as it subsequently became, was hugely important in generating then, as an institution of tolerance, institutionally reproducing tolerance, I think, for future generations. It became one of the most important places for Indian Muslim secular thought, and indeed through the 20th century, most historians of the second half of the 20th century will know it as the hotbed of Indian secular Marxist historiography, a place then certainly based around the notion of India as a pluralistic society, and that Muslim institutions generate tolerance through the study of the other, whether through the English language or through the study of a pluralistic Indian past. But still, as I've said, these encounters and exchanges, the geographies of exchange, don't always have their outcome as tolerance. There's not always positive social capital. We have to make way as well for the recognition that intolerance is sometimes generated through these interactions. The emergence then, what I've seen in what I've written at least about this text, the Kalamarawi Uganda wa Mombasa, as it's called there, the account of Uganda and Mombasa, an Urdu text there from 1901. At least as I'm aware, the earliest Urdu first-hand account of Africa, a travelogue of Uganda and the city Mombasa, the port city, based around an itinerary along the Uganda Railway, which was being built at this period. And indeed, the person who wrote it seems to have been one of the clerks or headsmen working on the Uganda Railway. But what we have there isn't the generation of tolerance, the generation of inclusion, but also is in the same way as I've argued that we've seen the shared generation of tolerance, we can also have the shared mutual generation of intolerance. The borrowing then of colonial denigrated British attitudes towards African peoples, these kind of exoticist images that we use to publicize the railway, were also adopted and borrowed, and also drawing on an earlier Islamic tradition as well, it has to be said, of denigrating images of African peoples as well. In the text, in the Kalamarawi text, we have Africans described as Adam Khor, as cannibals, as Vahshi peoples, wild peoples whose religion was nothing other than jadoo, than magic. So intolerance can also spread through contact and spread in these kind of mutual ways as well, the borrowing, if you like, or the sharing of a dual Anglo-Islamic imperial discourse. And of course there's a geography, there's a context to this too. It's labour competition, unequal exchange for work and incomes based around the workers of the Uganda Railway, of whom the writer of that text was one. Intolerance then is also situational, just like tolerance. Well, we've looked at some Persians and some Indian travellers. Let's look at some Afghans as well. In particular, this figure on the left, Mahmoud Tarzi. He himself left a travelogue that he actually borrowed the title from Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, and his own title of a description of a tour around part of the world in 22 days, kind of outdoing Verne in some ways. And what's important with Mahmoud Tarzi, in many ways he's the Afghan equivalent to Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who we saw found in the school in India. He's a traveller, a great promoter of intercultural exchange. He was, for a while, ambassador of Afghanistan to Paris, I think the first Afghan ambassador to Paris, in fact. And he was also a great promoter of science and looking to the West for scientific learning, but also doing this through the medium of culture. The first novels ever published, in Afghanistan, were translated and published by Mahmoud Tarzi, and the first novels ever published in Afghanistan were the writings of Jules Verne. Around the World in 80 Days among them, and here in the Persian title Siyahat dar Javi Hava, a journey up into the atmosphere, a translation of Verne's work Robert the Conqueror, which is a story of a giant dirigible and how this great big balloon travels around the world. So there's, as it were, a culture of science then, a culture of imported science, and that a great deal of positive value then was given by this important statesman to the West and to Europe as a space not only of culture and cultural emulation, but also of scientific emulation too. We start to move then from an attitude of Middle Eastern and South Asian, Central Asian Muslim travellers to Europe, an attitude or a language that we saw earlier of wonder, of hayrat, towards a language of taraqi, of progress. The progress was something that Europe had, and that figures like Mahmoud Tarzi wanted to import from that space to another space. From Tarzi's generation here from the mid-1930s, from the most important Afghan literary magazine of probably the 20th century, Kabul magazine, founded around 1930, we have here an image of course, a kind of a low-riding, very much kind of the design of the 1930s. This was how Afghans of the 1930s imagined the future of their country. They admired the taraqi, the progress of Europe and America, and they wanted to import and reproduce it in America, in Afghanistan. We have a move then from wonder to progress, from hayrat to taraqi, which perhaps reminds us of the old adage that imitation is certainly the highest form of flattery. How was that to be brought about? Well, travel and interaction, again, were the means of that. Not least through the great royal journey of King Amanullah and Queen Soraya. Amanullah ruled from 1919 to 1929, and in 1928 they took on a multi-month-long tour of the whole of Western Europe. The aim was to bring back European ideas, secular ideas, to modernize and also liberalize Afghanistan. This was the beginning, the period as well of the Afghan women's movement. Photographs like this one of Soraya Tarazi, she was of the same family as Mahmoud Tarazi, who we saw a moment ago, were printed in Paris Vogue. She had interviews with all sorts of other figures. I think there was a two-way generation of tolerance as well then. A real fascination with Afghans, a real fascination with Soraya Tarazi in particular, that is very different, I think, from the attitudes towards Afghans in Europe and the West in the age of the Taliban. So, again, we have this kind of not only geographies, but also the mutuality of tolerance and understanding. But again, things don't always work out so nicely. On that tour, his tour of Europe, Amanullah chose to spend the longest period of his journey, 6 weeks, in Germany. If it wasn't by then Nazi Germany, it was still Weimar Germany. Nonetheless, much of the ideas that, the European ideas that Amanullah took back were of a distinctively Prussian flavour, not least his form of moustache, it's often been noted. We have then also brought back from Europe in the 1920s and 30s, not only to Afghanistan, but also to Iran, elements of Aryan theory and Aryan race theory. It's not least through linking back to the ancient name for Afghanistan, or one of the many ancient names for Afghanistan, Ariana, which was given appropriately enough, or maybe inappropriate enough, to the first Afghan airline founded in subsequent decades. So interaction then, and interaction and exchange can not only export tolerance, can not only export the good things from the West, but also exchanges and interaction can export some of the bad things, the negative things from the West as well. Well, let's move away from state-level visits towards something that looks more like tourism and the equivalent of the Muslim Grand Tour. I can't resist talking about this person, Salah Jung, to give him his shorter name from his long title, Nawab Mir Laik Ali Khan Imad al-Mulk Sultan, Sir Salah Jung Bahadur, Knight Commander of the Indian Empire, Salah Jung for short. I can't resist talking about him because I spent much of my 20s as a tour leader taking British tourists around India and the Middle East, and Sir Salah Jung seems to have been something of an equivalent. He took a grand tour that took in not only Venice, Florence, Athens, Paris, where he bought many paintings and shipped them back to India, which would be the makings of the Salah Jung Museum that some of you might know of in Hyderabad. He also visited many of the industrial centres and many of the working class groups of industrialising Europe. He even went to my hometown. I was very happy to see when I first bought the travelogue he wrote there, published in Bombay in Persian around 1890. His tour also, the image there was from Vanity Fair magazine. So again, we have some of the cultural dimensions of exchange and tolerance as being two-way. The geographies of contact for him were very different, perhaps much more mundane. He spends much of his travelogue describing how much he enjoyed the hotels he was visiting. The hotel he stayed in Bombay, Watson's Hotel, perhaps the first solid iron hotel ever built in the world. And then he stayed later in this hotel there in Birmingham. He stayed with his party quite a long time in Birmingham, partly because it appears from the diary they're trying to dry out from drinking too much whiskey in the previous weeks, but also to keep on to return to the theme of affection, that he seems to have developed an admiration, an affection for a certain Madame Albani. Madame Albani, a curious figure. She was a small-town girl from rural Quebec, who became Canada's first great musical export. She was, of course, the Celine Dion of her day. And Salah Jung was absolutely infatuated with her. He made many visits while he was staying there in Birmingham to Droitwich and to music halls, and went again and again. I think there's a certain language then, a certain kind of form of practice then of toleration, moving from admiration that we've seen perhaps in earlier case studies towards affection and indeed infatuation. Certainly Salah Jung, with the art collection he took back, I don't know to what extent he took back any early phonographs, but I dare say he did take back a few LPs, but certainly he took back with him much as it were of the cultural baggage of his grand tour to help ultimately lay the foundations of the most important of its period collection of Western art, European art in India. I'll shift scales a little bit now then, moving away from those kind of small spaces of interaction, the music hall, the hotel, towards these bigger cosmopolitan port cities, not least the city of Bombay itself. This then is still the theme of geographies of contact, nodes of contact and exchange in the language of globalization. And Bombay, of course, was in many ways, as it still is, one of the great kind of melting pots of Asia, one of the spaces of toleration. But these, of course, these great global cities were also spaces of the generation of tolerance and the generation of intolerance. These major port cities, Bombay, like San Francisco, of course, were also spaces of, is it a modern phenomenon or not? I don't know, but certainly spaces of that phenomenon of the 19th century, the communal or race riot. The Bombay Muslim Parsi riots of 1874, the San Francisco Anglo versus Chinese riot of 1877. There was then a discourse then, a language of the anti-cosmopolitan, language of the intolerant as well. In the 1888 Persian travelogue we have of the Iranian traveller to Bombay, Naib Sadr Shirazi, wrote here in this, my translation here, a kind of anti-qasida, an anti-panegyric to the city and all of its pluralistic communities. I saw there in that land many a sect among the Hindus. One of them bowed down to a cow in devotion, while another calls the sun with the name of God Almighty. To another side I saw a most miserable crew who spend their days in praying for trees to come and save them. I saw there too in Bombay a community of Jews who dream up every sort of disorder that can be. Their hearts I saw all drowning in their dreams of gold and silver, for not one of them can tell the difference between a Friday and a Sabbath. I saw yet another group in that most lovely country, a filthy folk indeed, whom they call the Englishmen. Each and every Englishman but thinks of his own fortune. He is sweet but to himself and sour to every other. And so Naib al-Sadr went on for several more verses, inveighing against every community of Bombay, including the various different kinds of Muslims in Bombay that as a Shiite he decided were not real Muslims either. We have then languages and discourses of intolerance as well. These other products, the less happy products then of these global exchanges. But there are also, in the period I'm focusing on today, new spaces of interaction, new spaces that could generate tolerance or intolerance, new spaces of cultural interaction as well. Not least the great equivalent in Japan to Bombay, Yokohama, the great steam port of Meiji, Japan. Here depicted here one of the Russian churches that opened up with various Europeans distinguished by their red clothes painted by Hideshige III in the Yokohama-e school of painting that really focused on all of the world there in Yokohama. And sure enough, as all the world was arriving then, Middle Eastern and other Muslims started to take an interest in Japan. But it was a strange and perhaps unexpected and perhaps unhappy way of generating tolerance towards Japan. After all, Japan had been a place of Shintoists and a place of Buddhists, a religion or set of religions that had never really been brought under that old tolerant umbrella of the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book. The Buddhists, let alone the Shintoists, were never considered righteous or viable religions by Muslims. So it was really a great kind of leap of understanding, a kind of great leap of cosmopolitanism and even tolerance in the 19th century, the late 19th century, when Muslims from various countries started to look to Japan not only with interest, but also to look to this non-Muslim, Buddhist, Shintoist nation as another place of progress, of the future, a place on which to emulate. But the unhappy dimension of this newfound tolerance was that it emerged out of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, when the Japanese defeated the Russians, the first time, as many will know, when of an Asian power in any significant way defeated a European power in the modern period. So on the principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend, Japan became a place of great infatuation, the beginnings of a Japanophilia that spread everywhere from the Ottoman Empire through to the Malay Muslims of Southeast Asia. We have here then a book printed in Persian in Calcutta, but then exported to India. Again, these port cities of interaction by Hussein Ali Shirazi in the Mikado Nama, a Persian praise poem in the manner of the Shahnameh of ancient, as it were, the national epic, as it's called, of Persia, of the ancient kings of Persia, but praising instead the Mikado, the Japanese emperor. And here they are, the Japanese troops on the battlefield. that Japanophilia spread elsewhere too. It spread to Afghanistan as well, where that same Mahmoud Tarzi published in around 1912 his Tarikh-i Muharaba, Rus or Japan, the history of the Russo-Japanese War. So we have that strange and unhappy conundrum of war somehow generating tolerance, at least for a third party, for the Japanese, if not for the Russians. Following on then, this kind of interest that was generated by the war, a sequence of Middle Easterners and other Asian Muslims start to travel to Japan, creating new spaces of interaction, even spaces of tolerance in the port cities of the Pacific. This is a period, after all, the decades either side of 1900, particularly the 1900s onward, where various cities along the Eastern Asia, particularly in Northeast Asia, I'm thinking of Shanghai and I'm thinking especially of Harbin, start to harbour very important Jewish communities as well as Muslim communities. The city of Harbin, that was ruled by Russia, then handed over, I think, in 1917, 1918 to China, is a place where we have not only the earliest synagogue, but also the earliest mosque in Northeast Asia. So these were new communities, new cities, new spaces of interaction, of mutuality and of tolerance. And various Middle Eastern Muslims, like the Persian Mehdi Quli Hidayat in the middle of the picture there, wanted to go and see Japan for themselves. Hidayat wrote a very long travelogue, not only about to Japan. He was actually making a Hajj. He was making the journey to Mecca. But instead of just going, as it were, due south from Tehran, he went the opposite way, went north into Russia, crossed the entire of Eurasia by the Trans-Siberian Railway, knocked around China for a bit, described some Chinese temples, described the Forbidden City in Beijing, in Peking, goes to Japan, and then we'll see some more of his travels later. So here he is, the Vuruji Japan, the entry into Japan here from his travelogue. He was an avid postcard collector too, which is nice because it lightens up, along with his photographs, his diary. What we see developing then in Hidayat's encounters in Japan is an entirely new understanding of Shintoism, a religion that hadn't even been on the, as it were, on the list of religions, let alone the list of recognized good, true religions by Muslims prior to this point. Here he is visiting the House of the Spirits in Nikko in Japan, one of the most famous of all Shinto pilgrimage centers in Japan. We have here then the development of a new tolerance beyond the older form of the Ahli Kitab, the idea that Christians and Jews and perhaps also Zoroastrians and maybe also Hindus had genuine revelatory religions. The idea then that tolerance could be progressive, that it develops, that it has a history, that it changes. Hidayat went even beyond looking at Shintos, and I think adds here what we might think of as it were a south-south interactions, except that in the terms of the day they are framed as east-east, sharq-sharq interactions then, but bringing in maybe even the fourth world, humanizing the Ainu, the indigenous peoples of Hokkaido in northern Japan. Of course, here in one of the sort of sensationalist images of the time, but there's nonetheless a sympathetic portrait of these indigenous peoples of a part of Japan, Hokkaido, that had only in the previous century been colonized by Japan proper. So these are then a broadening range then of places as well as peoples brought into, as it were, a new kind of tolerance. Another figure who we might look at then, another of these Japanophiles, was Sayyid Ras Masood. He was the grandson of the same Sayyid Ahmad Khan who we've seen going to London and founding that important college in India. He wrote a very important book in the 1920s, published in Hyderabad, Japan and its Educational Order and Administration. Here we have him describing the Tokugawa Sultanate as a place that was safe and peaceful. A very, if you like, kind of very positive image then to building on the idea of Japan as a place of progress, but a place that Japan is a place of having a rich civilization that might also be admired as well, a place of order and peace and stability. Masood in his diary then was actually he wrote a diary as well as this account of Japan's education, because his too was an educational visit. But he didn't want to take back to India, like his grandfather had done, English institutions of education. He wanted to transport back Japanese educational institutions and models. But also while he was there, maybe as a tourist, perhaps as a Japanophile, he very much immersed himself into the Japanese culture of the time. Here he is dressing up, a Muslim shogun, Ras Masood. And it's fitting as well, because to return to that idea of tolerance as something two-way. He never learned Japanese, but he met with various Japanese scholars who had studied like him at Oxford, and the language that they shared was English in their case. But again, communication was important in generating the understanding and tolerance that he showed in his travelogue and his account of Japan. But again, there were many people in this dialogue. It's the same Ras Massoud. Those of you who have ever read E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, published the same time as Massoud's own book, published in 1924, it's dedicated to Ras Massoud. Because Ras Massoud wasn't only the friend of Forster, there's a whole collection of their letters that has been published, the letters they exchanged. Massoud is probably also, it seems, the lover of E.M. Forster. So again, emotional and the affective, I think, sides of tolerance. Even Ras Massoud's name, it's a rather odd name for a Muslim, you might have thought. Sayyid Ras Massoud. He was named after his father's Scottish teacher. So there's very much in there, I think, of a family tradition of tolerance, a family tradition of an ongoing patterns of exchange of humanity, of affect, of emotion. Perhaps summed up in the epigraph to E.M. Forster's other great novel, Howard's End, of 1910. The epigraph, Only Connect. Well, moving on from Japan and moving further west, Hidayat, who we've already seen, the Persian going to Japan, continues his journey by crossing across from Yokohama, the steam port, to San Francisco. He describes the city there. Now there is postcards there, the giant redwoods. He describes being interviewed in San Francisco then in 1904 by a female journalist. It was a progressive city even back then. And he generates, I think, some of the first or the earliest positive Muslim views of the United States, some of the earliest first-hand Muslim depictions of the United States altogether, an American affiliate perhaps to match with the Japanophilia. What we're getting then through these new global circuits and movements in this period, of course, very new spaces of exchange that are generating entirely new discourses, entirely new languages, entirely new terms of understanding and of tolerance. In other cases, moving to another port city on the east coast of New York City, we have a travelogue in Persian by Abdullah Bahrami, who moved to New York or visits New York in 1925. He left a very long and very positive account in Persian of the United States, of its factories, of its achievements, of its different peoples, of its work ethics and values that he hoped to take back and transform Iran. But again, those exports from the West to the Middle East and elsewhere aren't always positive as well. Unhappily, perhaps, Abdullah Bahrami was the deputy head of the police force of Iran. What he took back with him from his visit to New York to attend the International Police Conference of 1925 were new policing techniques that surely helped to establish Reza Shah's police state that emerged in Iran in the subsequent years after Bahrami's return. We also, I think, can see through Bahrami that tolerance, I think, is sometimes dialogical. It depends to whom one's speaking. In his Persian account, written for his readers back in Iran, there's a very positive view of the United States. And yet interviewed here by the Daily Argos, newspaper in the Daily Argos, I'm not sure where that newspaper was from, but he gave a very negative depiction. Something wrong with American homes. There was a problem with American values. Chiefly that children didn't respect their parents enough. Back in Persia, this would never happen, he wrote. So, as I'll end, or move towards an ending, I want to sort of stay and reflect a moment again on this kind of negative forms of interaction as well, which we, kind of cannot deny as some of the outcomes of these exchanges. The most famous, the most infamous, perhaps Muslim visit to the United States, at least in the period I'm looking at here, was Sayyid Qutb, the modern founder of political Islamism, who was executed in Egypt in the 1960s. He traveled as an exchange student, or indeed as a master's student, and lived for around a year in the small town of Greeley in Colorado. He depicted that in a book he wrote in Arabic on his return, The America I Have Seen in the Scale of Human Values. And for Sayyid Qutb, what he'd seen in Greeley, what was apparently quite a very conservative, religious town, a town where at that time it wasn't even possible to buy alcohol when he was there in 1949. But what he saw there, what he described there, dancing and sensuality, even sexuality expressed in church hall dances, the very churches themselves are spaces of sexuality and sensuality. This was an America of immorality, not an America of progress, not an America of wonder, but a place of immorality. The comparison between cultures then, the comparison between different places for Sayyid Qutb was to be weighed up in a scale of human values. Values then weren't just to be tolerated, they were to be weighed up. Some weighed heavy like gold, some didn't, American values. So we have then a very different pattern then, not so much wonder, but an America or Western world of immorality. Well, to conclude then, I think what we've seen is that tolerance is contextual and conditional. It's not innate. I'd imagine that comes as no surprise to such a learned audience, but I think that's nonetheless a good thing that we learn that it's not innate. If some cultures or religions were inherently intolerant or tolerant, then that would be bad news. But, I don't think that is the case. What we have seen, though, is that tolerance emerges from contact and exchange, and especially from communication and from education, from cultural understanding, which is, after all, what we do here in the University of California. The making of tolerance, then, is something that is not only out of our hands as humans, it's not only contextual, it's not only geographical, it's not only preordained by discourses and cultures, it's something that is in people's hands. It can be made. This human scale analysis, then, that we've seen here today, I think shows that not only context, but also private choice is a part of the making of tolerance. The psychological and I think the affective, emotional dimension that we've seen surely show that. And as the world continues to shrink, there's no doubt that there surely will be more contact and exchange between different peoples of different religions. People then can choose to be tolerant, or at least let's hope they will. Thank you very much.